Hello YouTube. Today I'm going to talk about my bias and why it's better than your bias. So, to begin, when we think of bias, we can basically attach it to an ideology. Ideologies and bias are basically the same thing, two sides of the same coin, because your ideology shapes your bias and your bias determines your ideology, right? Because some biases are learned, other biases you're born with, and some parts of ideology you're born with, other parts you learn, and that part you learn is a huge part. So considering that idea, my bias or ideology is a negative one. It's based on results and experiments, on observation. It's open-ended. Other biases are positive, though. They're based on rules and expectations. They fill up content. They tell you to do things. They're not about allowing things.'re more about doing things. They're not about seeing what happens. They're more about expecting something to happen and force that outcome. So, what's an example of a negative ideology? And when I say negative, please, I'm not talking about like value. I'm talking about like content-wise. Like, I'm not judging it and saying it's a good or bad thing. What I'm saying is the positive and the negative content. I'll explain it actually right now. So the negative content is something like what they call in philosophy Quietism, which is based a lot on Wittgenstein's philosophy. Basically, instead of trying to contribute like a thesis to people, like this is the way the world is and you must conform, instead it tries to look at the situation and reframe it according to some like principle that's open-ended, like a like experimentation or seeing what happens, like doing something and allowing to see what happens. So Quietism would be like, instead of telling someone this is what your problem is and this is how we can solve your problem, instead it tries to look at the problem itself and just say, is this really a problem? It's more like a pseudo problem, and then try to rework their mind in the way of not telling them, hey, believe this, believe A, B, and C, but instead reevaluate certain things and then see how what was a problem wasn't really a problem. And this is not for just one or two problems. This is for everything. So you can see that you're not like shaping your mind around a single ideology. Instead, you're kind of like deprogramming an ideology in a sense. But in itself, that process of deprogramming, that process of looking at your problems and trying to identify them as pseudo problems, is in itself an ideology. And this is why I'm making this distinction between these kinds, because I don't want to say that I have no ideology or no bias. Of course I do, but my bias is open-ended. It's based on, like I said, experiment and logic and seeing how things fit to that, right? It's not based on thinking that someone is always right, or that a book has all the answers, or I don't need to test the waters to understand anything. I just know it from someone telling me, and I don't need to look around at all. So I hope I'm getting a little clear what it really means to have a positive and a negative ideology. So another positive ideology would be, for instance, Christianity. It would tell you must believe in Jesus and you must respect Sunday and this, that, and the fourth, right? But another example of a philosophy, an ideology that's not positive is also liberty. This idea of liberty. Liberty is not a positive ideology. It doesn't require us to act in any specific way. Instead, it says you have the liberty to act, or the potential to act in whichever way you like, just as long as you don't interfere with the liberties of other people. And this, as you can see, is an ideology. It's an ideology that says do what you want, or find your own potential. But at the same time, it manifests in everyone differently. So it's not like, again, Christianity or Buddhism, or I'm sorry, not Buddhism, but a better example would be like Islam, where they're telling you must believe A, B, C, and D, and everyone must conform to this belief. Where instead, a negative ideology says everyone has a belief in evidence, a belief in reason, a belief in logic, right? And that these are open-ended. They don't approach situations in a totalitarian way. They don't just come up to a situation and say, this is it, and that's all. Instead, like I said, it's experimental. It comes up to a situation and says, well, how does this work with what I know? And then, as you can see, it just allows, it's more of a door that allows information to come in, as long as it reaches a certain kind of standard or can fit with a certain observation or logical analysis or step. So another way to look at it is positive ideologies are like proscriptions. They tell you must do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and you must pray 7 times a day and whatnot. While a negative ideology just says, how does this measure up with this? And so, for instance, in liberty, it would say, how does this situation measure up with your liberty? Are you exercising your liberty? And are you doing it in a way that doesn't hurt other people? You see, that's a rule. That's a kind of rule. It's a different kind of rule from saying you must not eat pork. You see, so I hope I'm getting a little more clear that when the content of the ideology tells the person you must believe X, Y, and Z, that's positive. It's adding something. It's telling you must this. Where in liberty or negative ideology, it's somewhat taking something away. It's saying you have liberty now. You have the freedom to do this. Or in terms of logic or experimentation, say, how does this measure up through evidence? How does the evidence measure up? It's not just a blanket thing. It changes with every situation. So in a way, another way of looking at it, positive ideologies don't change with the situation. They stay the same. Or negative ideologies work with the situation. They're not exactly completely taken over by the situation, but they work with it in a certain way. It's like a conjoining, a mutualism. So, for instance, in logic and experiment, you could approach the situation by experimenting things and testing to see if it follows, to see if it's logically coherent, or to see if an observation follows after a manipulation. And then another kind of in liberty, it would be, is the situation, are you allowed to do what you want as long as you don't mess with anyone else? Is this being practiced? Is this what's going on? So you can see how the ideology is still shaping the behavior. It's still shaping the way the person understands reality and what they're doing. But it allows the person more freedom, or it is more malleable to the situation. And that allows growth. So that's what makes something like science or liberty growing, like economic liberalism, something that grows, as opposed to faith or heavy religion, where it doesn't really grow. It may grow in number, but the ideology doesn't change at all, right? I mean, people were using reason and logic back in the 1500s, but the way that what they're pulling up with that, with what they're discovering about the world through reason and logic is much different than what they're doing today. As for something like Islam, for example, how it sees the world hasn't changed at all. It's, even though it's still using the same books, same techniques, it hasn't changed. Whereas science or an ideal of liberty was doing the same thing, quote unquote, but now the outcome and the results are different. It's changed, it's morphed, it's evolved, but there's still an underlying rule and logic to it. So I hope I'm getting more and more clear on what makes an ideology negative or not, or a bias negative as opposed to positive. If I have a bias towards evidence, that's negative, because, as I said, it approaches the situation, doesn't impede anything on it. It says, well, what is the test up to this? Whereas, if I believe that only what the Bible teaches is true, that's a positive ideology. It's a positive bias. When I approach a situation, it's already completely, totally takes over it and says, this is the way it is. There's no room for there's no wiggle room at all, and there's no evolution in the concept. This is the way it is. Shut your mouth. So I basically believe that negative ideologies are better because they lack elements of tyranny and fundamental fundamental collectivism and totalitarianism. It lacks elements of tyranny because the situation is not totally taken over by an idea. Instead, the idea allows for other ideas to come through as long as they conform to some logical process, like not hurting other people and expressing yourself, or rules of evidence. Right? It helps fight against fundamental collectivism because it promotes individualism, people to think for themselves. A negative ideology gives one more responsibility. It says, well, you know a certain sets of tools and steps, and so you need to apply this in this situation and see what happens, as opposed to this is always the right answer and always say it. So in this way, it allows people to see themselves from their own point and see their actions from their own point of view, as opposed to some fundamental collective idea, right? Because let's say liberty is a collective idea, but everyone expresses their liberty in different ways. Christianity is a collective idea, but everyone has to be the same way. So in this way, and I've already explained in other video how collectivism is an illusion and should not be something we stem from. We should stem always from the self and go out from that. And we'll reach a collective identity only when anchored in a self first. So there's no problems with collective identities, but when it's fundamental, where you remove yourself and your personal identity becomes the group and not the self, and that's the core of it. That's the problem. And it stops totalitarianism in thinking, because you're not impeding but not forcing an idea to a situation, and not allowing that specific and unique situation to result in a specific and unique outcome. Instead, a negative ideology allows for the situation to meet the ideology and see a specific outcome. And that outcome may be different across time and across people and across space. So it stops, a negative ideology stops tyranny in that same way. It doesn't allow an idea to overtake and control a situation. And as I said already, with fundamental collectivism, it promotes individualism. So, of course, your mileage may vary in all of this, but this is what I believe. And I just want to note that I know this is a provocative title. I know, but I just want to, basically say, I'm not saying that you may have believed that already. You may have had an idea of a negative ideology or bias. So I'm not, I was just trying to be provocative as a way to make you click on the link, and as you're listening to this, it worked. So, so please don't harp on the link. Say, I already believe in negative ideology. I already understood this. What are you saying? Okay, it was just being provocative as a form of rhetoric. Okay, so I just want to end with a little, my liberty is, in this way, is an axiom. This negative idea, I think all ideologies are axioms. There's no way to prove them outside of their systems. For instance, there's no evidence for empiricism, right? The only reason why we use empiricism is because we want certain results and we get those results. So it's arbitrary. So in this way, liberty and most negative ideologies are a form of, or if not all negative ideologies, are a form of pragmatism. They're based on pragmatic outcome. They're based on trying to achieve something and getting it. It's arbitrary, but in a self-evident way, we validate it because it helps us do what we want. This is why I'm so connected with the idea of liberty, because I see it as this essential thing of pragmatism where, we do what we want because we do what works for us. So why would you dismiss that? Why would you dismiss that? You say, well, I want a traditional ideology. I want something that's tried and true. But that, I feel, ignores evolution and change and growth. So, in my sense, I believe it is the superior kind of ideology. Negative ideology is better for the world. I cannot force it on anyone, but I can only lead by example. And I can only ask, too, why dismiss it? Why dismiss the idea of liberty or the idea of a negative ideology? Why? I invite anyone to try to refute this idea in any way, because I don't see a reason to not get on board with this idea of negative ideologies and how it may help us in our thinking and our relationships with each other, and even on global levels. And tolerance over anything. Tolerance, and it's not just tolerance, but better for yourself. You get to do what you like. You get to do what you want. As long as you don't mess with other people. And that's defined in another video, or I'll take another time to define exactly what it means to interfere with someone in liberty. But for now, we can just understand the basic of my point, that my bias is different from your bias, and my bias is a better bias because it's a negative bias. It allows, it's a bias and an ideology that allows me to approach situations in an open-ended way so I can learn something new, as opposed to a positive bias where I'm not learning anything new. I'm just forcing an idea on a situation, and I'm not learning anything from that situation. So if you want to learn and grow and understand the situations you in and that you encounter in life, have a negative ideology. A positive ideology may comfort you to what life may bring you down on, like the negatives of it, but it would always stunt your growth and progress as a being and as a society, because you do affect other people. So I urge you all that if you care about growth and learning and understanding, have a negative bias or ideology. We can never escape our biases. We can never, because it's always axioms. An axiom can never be proven. It's always going to be a bias. But in my opinion, pragmatic bias is the best. And because it's a negative ideology, liberty is the best. You can't mess with it. I encourage you to take up a negative ideology. I encourage you to. It's only with that we can see real societal change for those that want it. I mean, liberty is already a very revolutionary idea that will change the world for the better. Let's bring it further. Let's bring it further so that we can see it see it flourish. Have a negative ideology. If you care about learning, if you care about understanding, care about tolerance, have a negative ideology, have a negative bias. You can never escape bias, but if you know your bias, if you understand your bias, that's all. That's sufficient to be able to be one step above them, to be not in complete control of them, but in working with them in accordingly. Working with them accordingly. So, thank you very much for listening. Please leave comments, any kind of comments, like, dislike, just feedback would be great. So thank you very much. Have a great one. This is Meta Self, and I'm done and I'm out of here.